Welcome to this presentation regarding Interoffice Memoranda. We're going to talk about some strategies for writing Interoffice Memoranda today. I've provided in Module 2 several tools that should help you with your Interoffice Memoranda. Let me go to my desktop so we can look at what I'm looking at. Okay, so here we go. You ought to be seeing a document that you'll find in your folder called Legal Writing Form and Substance. I want to bring this document to your attention. It's not directly related to writing Interoffice Memoranda, but it is a very helpful overview on the topic of legal writing. We'll be talking more about legal writing, the drafting part, the substantive part during some later lectures, but I wanted you to kind of start your familiarity with the topic now. This document isn't going to be so helpful in drafting Interoffice Memoranda, but it is something that you're responsible for and that can be covered both on the midterm and the final examination. But I wanted to introduce this to you and then move on so you can see this can be a useful resource for you to have, but it may not be one that you're going to be needing necessarily today. Another useful tool is from OWL, from Purdue University. And there are 4 items in their memos file. A couple of things to mention about OWL. First of all, it's a very useful place to get writing information, but it's not intended for a specifically legal audience. So some of the things that we see here may not be that helpful for you as a paralegal. But let's get started. You can see the first bullet is audience and purpose. Now for the assignment that you have this week, you are told what the purpose is and what the audience is. But certainly if you are drafting your own memorandum, you may well have to make some of these decisions. This is helpful information. Again, you can be tested over it, so I want you to be familiar with it even though it's not really part of the assignment. Let's go to the next section, parts of a memo. You'll need to have a heading. Now this heading is very similar to the heading that we have provided as your model. The biggest difference from this heading, and the one that you're going to use is that they are not justified. You can see how the reader's name is going to start here, whereas your name is going to start here. They're not going to be lined up. This is more aesthetics than substance, of course, but you'll find many times in legal writing aesthetics are important factors. And it makes sense. You want your reader to be thinking, my, what an attractive document, I want to read it. It is helpful in encouraging the reader to want to read it. It is also helpful in encouraging the reader, hey, this person knows what they're doing. They prepared an attractive document for me to read. I have confidence that what's in this document is going to be stuff that I can use because I can see that it is thoughtfully designed and arranged. Now, does the reader actually have that conscious thought? Probably not. But on some level, he or she is thinking, yes, this is a professionally prepared document. It looks professional, so therefore I'm working under the assumption that the substance is going to be professional. And so you want to encourage the reader to think in those terms. So this format is a sensible one, but we're going to want to go a little step farther and make sure that these items are lined up nicely. Then OWL goes on to talk about how you're going to want to plan or organize the material in your Interoffice Memorandum. This is useful information. This gives lots of good ideas. You'll want to think about these, internalize these for the midterm and the final exam. But for the purpose of this assignment, pretty much the content of the memorandum is pre-written for you. You just have to revise it so it's grammatically correct. So don't focus for the assignment on spending a lot of time with making an opening segment in a context and a task segment. For one thing, this assignment is going to be very, very short, so many of these guidelines aren't really going to fit for a document as short as what we have today. One thing, though, you may want to think about is attachments. It's a good idea to think about what am I going to attach, if anything. Because if you're going to attach something, it may change what you say in your document. For example, if you've decided not to attach a document that you could attach, you might need to spend more space in your memorandum explaining what you're not attaching, describing it, for example. On the other hand, if you're going to attach it, you have to spend relatively little time describing it because the reader is going to be able to see it for himself. Let's go to the third section, which is called Format. This gives an idea about how you ought to allocate space for these various categories. Again, not so useful for this assignment, but this can be a good rule of thumb as you're planning your document. We aren't going to do legal research memoranda in this course, but you'll have the opportunity to write those in legal writing. And we'll also talk about those in the legal research class. So these are some interesting rules of thumb. I'm not sure that they're going to replace, though, the information that you're going to be learning in that course. And finally, we have a sample memo. Again, this is kind of this jagged edge. Don't really want to see this, but the topics themselves are good. And you can see they don't indent the paragraph. That's going to be my recommendation to you as well. We've talked in earlier broadcasts that there can be lots of different correct formats for legal documents. It's not wrong if your particular firm has its style manual that you actually indent a paragraph. It's also not wrong if your style manual says you don't indent. For the purpose of this class, our style manual is that we don't indent. So this is the look that we want. We're going to have all of our material flush up against this left margin. We call this left justified is the term for it. For our very brief memo, we're not going to be using headings or things like that, but you can see here the writer has used headings and he's used bold to convey that. In a legal memorandum, you would probably specify these with either a Roman numeral 1, Internet advertising, Roman numeral 2, television advertising, something along those lines. It's very common to use a Roman numeral formatting. It's not wrong not to, but if you have a memo of really any length, it lets the reader know the ordering of these topics and where they are in relationship to the topic. Bulleting is a very effective technique when you're writing a legal memorandum or really any document. It draws the attention of the audience to that particular material. My guess is that when you first saw this, almost before you even looked up here at the two in the front, you probably saw these bullets and said, okay, what's that? It draws our eyes in. We've got the interest of the bullets and we've got all this extra white space. So we're going to be looking at this and spending more time with this just with our eyes than practically any other material on the page. That's why bulleting can be so effective, but it can also be overused. You want to use bulleting when the very most important information is here. If these particular sites were unimportant, then you wouldn't want to bullet them because you can count on the reader paying extra attention to that. But if what you really want the reader to pay extra attention to is the paragraph below, we've kind of blown it because you're putting a big pointer on material that isn't important. So use bulleting occasionally, but make sure when you use it, you're using it for your best stuff, the most important stuff, the stuff you really want your reader to be paying attention to. So this is the information from Al. Now we're going to go to probably the most useful piece that we'll be talking about today, and this is the Interoffice memo material in Module 2. And this gives you some mechanics about how to set it up. Okay, I am going to flip over here to get a fresh page started. So I'm going to hit File, I'm going to hit New, and I'm going to hit Create. This is going to give me a blank canvas to work from. Now when you are practicing and routinely coming up with certain legal memoranda, you may well have a template to work from. And we're going to assume this is your very first legal memorandum that you've ever prepared at your law firm. You haven't been given a template, so you're working from scratch. That can happen, maybe it doesn't happen, but let's talk about how we do that to begin with. You can see here we're going to be talking about formatting. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to be concerned with the page layout. We're going to be concerned about the margins. Okay, so we're going to start, the default setting is going to be normal. This is going to be a 1-inch margin all the way around. But you can see there's other choices that are programmed into this setting. My last custom setting was actually the setup that we're going to use today, but I'm going to actually come up with a setting. So let's go back to the document that tells us our rules. We need a top margin of 2 inches and side margins of 1 inch and a bottom margin of 1 inch. So let's get that set up. So I'm going to put my top at 2 inches. You can see while I do it, the text actually gives you a preview. My left margin is already at 1 inch. My right margin is already at 1 inch. My bottom margin is already at 1 inch. Now if my memorandum was going to last more than a page, the next page would also be 2 inches down. Probably wouldn't want that. So I wouldn't set up my top margin to be 2 inches. I'd set it up to be 1 inch And then I would use returns to get it lower in the page, because if I set my margin to be 2 inches on the top, every single page of my document will be 2 inches. But my memorandum is really short, and so it's fine for me to set the top margin at 2 inches because I know I'm not going to go off onto the second page. Next choice is portrait or landscape. In a legal environment, you're almost always going to do portrait. The biggest time that you might do landscape is if you're doing Excel spreadsheets or something like that. And this gives you a preview of how your document is going to look. So I'm going to just hit OK, and I'm going to get started. Now we're going to go and select our fonts. Now Word is going to start me out with the font that I don't want. As we talked previously, I want Times New Roman 12-point font, so I'm going to start with that from the beginning. Okay. Now that I've gotten my basic formatting set up, I'm going to actually save the document. A utility to doing this, I'm going to call this Office Memorandum. Save it in a folder, or you could do a thumb drive or whatever. I'm just going to save it here generally. So now I have it named and I have it saved, and I'm a compulsive saver of documents. I save it, document probably 50 times while I'm writing, and even if it's a relatively short period of time, because I don't want to lose things. I know things can happen. I don't want to be in the situation where I wait till the end, I hit the wrong button, or that my computer crashes and I lose all that material. Nothing's more frustrating than that. But you can help yourself avoid that type of outcome if you habitually save it. So now we're going to go to, from, date, subject. There's a couple of things I notice here. First thing I notice is that the to is all capitalized, and it looks like it's in bold, as well as these other items. So let's go ahead and type those in. Before I do, I'm going to look at the margins that I have. I have it set for 1.15. I'm going to switch it back to 1 here. And then I'm going to not remove the space after the paragraph, but I'll show you what that does later on. So I'm going to do caps lock for now, and I'm going to hit bold. I'm going to do 2, colon, do another return, from, colon, colon, return, date, colon, return, and subject, colon. So let's go back to our, looks like that we're in good shape here. I'm going to tab once and twice. Let's see, I want to write this memorandum to Jane. Oops, I'm going to unlock my caps. I'm also going to take away the bold. I'm going to write this memo to Jane Smith. I am Larry Green. I still have the bold on. I'm going to make that go away. My date is June 13th. 2014, and you can see the way that I've designated my date is month, day, without a TH or other designation, just the number, a comma, a space, and the year. And then my subject. Your information about Mr. Jones's workers' compensation claim. Okay. This is a good-looking memorandum. You see how this is all nicely lined up. The J, oops, excuse me. Here we go. The J in Jane is directly above the L in Larry. This is how you want your document to look. In this case, I had to hit my tab button twice. This is what the tab button is. I'm going to hit it a few more times so you can see what that's like. Because to is, of course, a shorter word than subject, it requires 2 returns. Depending upon how your spacing on your computer is, it might be that you need to do 3 to get Jane lined up with Larry. You can see up here we have a ruler. Sometimes, the way some computers are configured, this ruler automatically comes up. One way to make it come up if it doesn't automatically is over here, and you can see as I hover this, it says View Ruler. So you can make it go away, and you can make it come up. You're almost always going to want that to be visible when you're working on a legal document. So you'd want to have that set up as kind of your default situation. Because I've typed this much, I'm just going to hit the Save button here, so I'm ready to go. Now, when we were back in the OWL document, they encouraged you to bold. Let me go back to where they talked about that. What the memo is about, highlighted in some way. And they made it sound like they wanted you to put it into bold, but you can see here they don't have it in bold. And I wouldn't recommend putting any of the specifics in bold. Of course, your particular style manual might require that you do that, and you'd want to follow at that time. But our style manual is that it ought to look like this. Now let's go back and look about this situation. I'm going to remove the space after the paragraphs. You see it all gets nice and close. I'm going to add them back. This is what we want. This should be your default pattern, to have the space after the paragraph. Now I'm going to type some content in. Okay, so you can see, let's see what our content is. You can see that there's a little bit, there's a little bit of a green underlining here. It's because I did 2 spaces. I grew up in a typewriting world, and so my habit is to put 2 spaces in here instead of just having 1 space. Oops, country. Because I've set up the computer to not like the 2 spaces, it's going to fuss at me when I do that. That's a good rule of thumb. In our style manual, we should only have 1 space between the period or whatever terminal punctuation we have and our capital letter that begins the next sentence. Again, your style manual may be different, but our style manual is have only 1 space there. So you can see when the carriage or when the typewriter went to the next line, it didn't put that extra space in here. So we have this extra space underneath the S in subject, but we don't have an extra space under the E in every. So let me again show you what it looks like if I were to remove this extra space. See, everything gets crammed up together. We don't want that because that extra space tells the reader that I, the writer, have a paragraph sign here, or told the carriage of the word processor, metaphorically, to go to the next line. So when I start a new paragraph, I don't have to indent it because it's very obvious that there is this space between the T in the word the and the T in the word this. There's definitely this space here. If I crammed everything together, you could see how it wouldn't be that easy to see 1 paragraph in and 1 paragraph didn't. In that type of universe, I probably would have to tab to show where the new paragraph is. But that's, again, not what our style manual says. Could another style manual do it that way? Sure. Would it be wrong? Would it be evil? Maybe. I'm teasing it. It wouldn't be evil, but it might be wrong. I'm not sure that would be the best practice. But you'd obviously follow your style manual even if it's not something you necessarily agreed with. So this is a well-designed, set up document here. Everything, again, is left justified. It's against this hard margin here that's 1 inch in. We have 2 inches up here, 1 inch here, 1 inch here, and we'll have 1 inch at the bottom if our document were that long. Our document is going to be super short, so we're good there. Now one thing, a couple questions that you might have, you might be tempted to use, we have left justification up here. You might be tempted to use both justification, right and left justification. I'm going to click it just so you can see what that looks like. It causes the text to be stretched out. There is the possibility that your style manual may require full justification. That isn't usually considered a best practice. It makes it more difficult for the reader to read the text. So this is going to be our usual rule, left justification. It does result in what's called a ragged edge here, but it makes the content much easier to read. Now you can see here I don't have all of those spaces and other context that I have here. So I'm going to put this in so when I'm editing I can see it. I'm actually going to blow this up bigger than my 12-point font so it becomes easy for you to see it. I'm going to bring it to 20. You can see all of the spaces, and you can see it has the context. If I were to make it justified, the spaces get very stretched out. And you can see this space, I only have 1 dot here, but you can see it's really, really extended. I have 1 dot here, but they're very close together. So this doesn't look as polished a document. It's more difficult to read. It looks usually less professional. So we're going to go back to the ragged edge, and then we're going to go back to a 12-point. Another thing that sometimes people are concerned about is, well, let's say this is the end of our memo. Look how much space is in this area. We only have a little bit of space up here. We have a lot of space up here. Do we want to center the document? Centering a document can be a good idea with a letter, but we don't do that for a memoranda. So if this document went on for pages and pages, we wouldn't move it up to get rid of these 2 inches here. But even if it's super short, we're not going to say, well, let's center it. Now, there are ways of doing that, but we're not going to do it in this particular example. Well, I'll even show you how to do that because it's not necessary for this purpose. So 4 letters, yes, sometimes it's a good idea, although there's lots of reasons why you may not want to do it. But we're not going to center the document for a memorandum. Okay, so let's go to some other tools that we might have. Let's go back to our reference item. Let's talk about the word subject. Many times the word that your style manual will have will not be the word subject, it will be the word ray. There's a couple of different meanings, and of course one thing I'd have to do if I did do rays, I'd have to do another return so these would nicely line up. There's a couple of different ideas behind why people use ray. One is that it might be a short version of the word race. Race is Latin for thing. So you could say, when you use the word race, or ray, which is a declined version of the word race, is that the thing that this memo is about is information about Mr. Jones's workers' compensation claim. Another one is that ray may be an abbreviation for regarding. It doesn't really matter what the real reason for it is, just whichever one helps you remember the thing. If you happen to have a style guide that is ray, it'll be, even if your style guide says subject instead of ray, you will receive lots of letters, lots of memoranda that have ray instead of subject. So I wanted you to be familiar with that, even though we're using subject here. So let's look and see if there's any other items. Begin all paragraphs of the memo at the left margin, which is left justified, and key them single space with 1 blank space between paragraphs. And again, that's what we've set up here. Now you may think, well, aren't I supposed to double space text? Doesn't that make it easier? Well, studies indicate actually single space is easier for us to read because you can get more substance on one page, and flipping pages can be pretty distracting. But when you're editing it, you may well want to move to a double space, because if you're the type of person who likes to edit by printing out and marking in the margins, you have a lot more space to work with here. Even if you're choosing to edit on the keyboard, maybe it's easier for you to make sense of it. Another way to do it, if you don't want to blow up if you don't want to change your spacing, is to blow up your font to move it to a higher number so you can see it more easily and make more editing choices. Okay, reference initials, let's talk about that. This is somewhat of an old-fashioned thing. It goes back to the days, I'll give you an example from my career. When I started practicing in 1990, attorneys and paralegals were not trusted with any word processing. We did not have an ability to create our own documents or edit our own documents. So if all I wanted to do was add a comma or remove a comma, I had to give it to a secretary, and she would make that change for me. As a result, you can imagine that law firms used to have a huge staff of secretaries, and they still do have a large staff of secretaries. And so whenever a secretary would have produced a memo for me, she would have included her initials. Let's say her name is Renee Green. So she would put RG at the end. Probably she would do it lowercase. And that would tell you that Larry Green actually wrote. He composed this memo, but the person who typed it is Renee Green. That's the difference. But if Larry typed it himself, he's not going to put his initials there. The assumption is that there's no initials, that Larry not only composed it, but also typed it. Now, this is much more common now than it once was. As I said, back in 1990, it was pretty much a given that an attorney or a paralegal who drafted a memo was not the one who was actually typing it. You may wonder, why were paralegals and attorneys not permitted to do their own word processing? Well, part of it was a cultural thing. The idea was that attorneys and paralegals shouldn't be spending their time doing that because the client was paying a significantly high hourly rate for these people's expertise. So if they were spending it doing a task that could be performed actually more efficiently by somebody who's being paid at a lower hourly rate, then that was a better use of the client's resources. But I'll be honest with you, that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was the word processing systems back then were very, I'll say very, but they were much more challenging to learn and master than they are today. And it was relatively easy for a person who made mistakes to crash the whole system, and so the whole law firm could go down. And so as a result, the paralegals and attorneys weren't trusted because they didn't have the time to invest in really learning the system, and they could cause a lot of mischief by doing wrong things in the system. So nowadays, again, that's not so much of an issue. Almost all paralegals and attorneys spend a significant amount of their time drafting documents in a word processing system. Usually it's going to be Word, and it's going to be Word Perfect. So let's go in here. Let's talk about the distribution list. You might send a document to more than one person. So let's say we're not sending it just to Jane Smith, but we're also sending it to Daniel Hernandez. And we're going to line him up right below, but we are not going to want a space here. So I'm going to remove the space here, but I need to add it there. And so let's say that, and now I want to also send it to Deborah, let's see, Deborah Jones. Actually, we'll make it Deborah Johnson. So you can see how these are going to be close together. Now there's different rules of thumb about how to organize these. A good rule of thumb is to organize them alphabetically, and I don't have them, so really Daniel should be first, then Deborah, and then Jane. Another can be grouping them by kind of the positions they have. Let's say that Jane is the only partner, then Daniel is an associate, an attorney who isn't a partner but is on partnership track, and Deborah Johnson is a paralegal. Well, you might arrange them based upon their titles. You'd have all the partners arranged together in alphabetical order, then all associates arranged together in alphabetical order, and then you'd have all the paralegals, or whatever the position might be, arranged in order. So there's different ways of organizing it. Again, that would be something you'd refer to a style manual about. I'm just going to say that our practice is going to be alphabetizing it because it makes it easiest for us, but that might not be the rule that you have. So I'm going to put Daniel Hernandez, I'm missing an R here. Okay, And then, of course, I'm going to routinely save it. So one question might be, let's say that Daniel Hernandez routinely likes to be called Dan Hernandez. And you may be sure, well, should I address it to Dan Hernandez or should I address it to Daniel Hernandez? Again, you may want to refer to your style manual, but usually for memoranda, you're going to use your more formal name. And if you're not sure, maybe you don't even know for sure if Dan's legal name is Daniel or whether it's just Dan or something else, a couple of ways you can check. Number one, if there is kind of an official roster, maybe on the letterhead of the law firm or maybe in some kind of directory, you might want to see how he lists his name there. Another place to look is at his business card if you have access to it. If he lists his name as Dan Hernandez on his business card, then you are safe to say Dan Hernandez here. But even if he's routinely called Dan Hernandez, if on his business card he uses Daniel, you'll want to use Daniel here. Another place to look is when he signs letters. If you have a copy of a letter, this can be a good way to look at. Let's say he closes his letter, very truly yours, and then he says Daniel Hernandez. In this space, he may type Dan Hernandez or Daniel Hernandez. So he might do a more chatty, more personal version of his name, but you'll want to look at the typed version of his name that goes below. And if he does Daniel Hernandez here, you're going to want to put Daniel Hernandez here. If he puts Dan here, then you'll want to put Dan here. Those are some rule of thumbs. I mean, don't stress over this too much, but if you have the ability to check that out, that can be a good way of making sure that you're not ruffling any feathers. I'm going to put it back to Daniel. That's a better practice probably. Let's assume that's what he prefers. Memoranda, like pretty much any example of legal writing, one of your goals as a legal professional is to spend as much time as you need to make the reader's job as easy as possible. You want to organize it, and here are some things you're going to want to do. Number one, you're going to want to make it clear from the very beginning what the document is about. Your subject line is going to accomplish a lot of that, but you may even need to have an introductory sentence to make it clearer what you're focusing on, maybe more specificity, more details. That can be useful. If the reader knows, hey, this is where the writer is going, the reader is much more likely to understand the trip. Some other strategies are to keep your word length relatively short. Now you may think to yourself, well, I'm writing to two attorneys and a paralegal. These are sophisticated people. They can handle more challenging words. You're absolutely right, they can. It's not that they lack a large vocabulary. But even if you happen to be a person with a tremendous vocabulary, everyone has a much smaller everyday working vocabulary than their best and their brightest vocabulary. And guess what? They can read simple words a lot quicker than more complex words. Let me give you an example. I'll write the word small. We all immediately know what that word means, but I'm going to write this word, minute. You also know what minute means. But guess what? When you see it, your brain stops for a second and think, does she mean minute or does she mean minute? Now this happens in a microsecond, but even though it's just a microsecond, it does take the brain that little bit of time to figure it out, and you've kind of stepped out of the context of the memo. And so, is minute a bad word to use? Should you never use it? No, of course it's a lovely word to use. But you're probably going to find small is the better word most of the time. Usually the shorter the word is, the fewer syllables it has, the better it is to use the word. Now there are other words too. You could say petite. You could say little. All of these words are perfectly good. I would say probably small would be the first choice, little would be the next choice, petite, and then I would say minute or maybe minuscule would be words that I would be less inclined to use. So those are some things to think about. Think about shorter words. It's not that you think the audience doesn't know the longer ones, but it's just going to take them that split second longer, and you want to make their job easy. You also want to have relatively short sentences, ideally 20 words or less in the average sentence. Doesn't mean that every sentence has to be 20 words or less, but you want that to be your average. When we talked before how we go ahead and do that, we go to review, we go to spelling and grammar, and if we set up our computer right, we'll get a readability index. We can see here the reading level is 3rd grade. That's awesome. You're not going to find that low of a number very often because obviously I've kind of written kind of Mickey Mouse sentences here, but that can be a good way to check your work. You also want to have relatively short paragraphs. Having 3 to 5 sentences is probably a pretty good rule of thumb for your paragraphs. You'll also want to have your document relatively short. If you can figure out a way to cut out extra sentences, that's a good thing. Brief is good. The less time the reader has to spend, the more likely he is to think positively about you, the better and more likely you are to persuade the reader about what you want him or her to do. Another point is you need to have your document very well organized, having it be very intuitive. Think about where your reader is. You've lived and breathed with this topic perhaps for a very long time. You know the ins and outs of it, but it may be Jane's first time to be familiar with this issue. And so you may have to hold her hand, metaphorically speaking, to get to all of the issues. It's a little bit like, and if you're sitting down with some friends and they have an inside joke and they keep on referring to something and you don't know what they're talking about, they're communicating very well with each other, but they aren't communicating very well with you. And so you have to keep on remembering what information does this person have, how involved and engaged is this person on this topic. If they're not very involved and engaged, you may need to spend more time getting them up to that comfort level. Okay. Let's go over and see if there's any other things we talked about. We talked about the distribution list. We talked about attachments and enclosures. Let's assume that we are going to include this. You're going to put it here, attachment, or you can put enclosure. And of course, if you have more than one attachment or more than one enclosure, you're going to add an S. Sometimes people abbreviate these. Again, you refer to your style manual for those types of items. And this gives you an overview about the organization. So this is our style guide for the purposes of legal memoranda. Hopefully this has helped you decide how to organize your documents so that you will have a clean and crisp looking document. Let's see if there's anything else we need to look at before we, intake memo. There's something else. This is an example of an intake memo. We're not doing an intake for this particular unit, but I wanted to show you this is in your sample documents file. It gives you a sense of a different way to organize this. So first of all, it's got a heading on it. We don't have a heading in our memorandum. But let's say that your style manual says we ought to have a heading. Well, let's look at how we might do a heading. I'm going to go to Insert. I'm going to go to Header, which is going to go at the top. I'm going to choose this format. Usually if you're going to have a heading like this on the top page, you're going to want to have it centered. I'm going to want to make sure my font's right. So I'm going to do Times New Roman. I might choose to up this up to 14, and I might want to make it bold. So I'm going to call this, actually, when I did all that, it undid my formatting, so I'm going to have to redo it. Here we go. That happens all the time to me. But here we go. That actually looks a little pitiful, so I'm going to make it bigger. Then I'm going to click down here, and I have this nice, lovely format. Now the problem with putting a header like this up here is that unless you set it up so it's just on the first page, it's going to be on every single page. You're not going to want this. But if it's a one-page memo, then this might be a lovely way of setting up the document. For our style manual, this word memorandum is optional. You can include it, or you don't have to include it. If you choose to include it, be sure that you are using a Times New Roman format. You can use a point that you think makes it attractive. Let's look at the intake memo just for a second. You can say this is a different heading here, and you can see it has the same names, but instead of saying subject, this says Ray. And again, you'd want to have it flush. So let's say this is to Henry Abbott from Lucille Smith, and the date is June 13th, 2014. We'll go through and talk about it. Sometimes you'll see people use the European dating system, but we don't use that here. And so it's better to keep it in the format that people are most familiar with, unless your style manual says otherwise. When you do it in this format, you need to have the month, space, date, without anything like the TH or anything, just the number, comma, space, and then the year. And you want to write out the whole year. And then the array might be, let's see, Frederick Bart, let's claim. We'll call it that. And so this gives you a sense about what the matters about. And you can see here, these weren't bold. That might be the style manual for your particular law firm, but I'm going to pretend like they are bold because I would say it's more common for them to be bold. You can see here in this example they actually have this line separating this heading from the body. There's nothing wrong with having the line. It's kind of nice aesthetically, but in our form manual, we don't have that line. We don't need to have it for the purposes of our particular assignment. Then you have the content here. You have it in paragraph form. And you can see they have various headings here that tell you about the material. So I just wanted to show you this one. This is not our style manual, but this is how you might work with a different style manual. Alrighty, let's see if there's anything else we need to go over before we've already gone through Purdue OWL materials. We've gone through setting up your document. I've shown you the legal writing form and substance document for your review. We've looked at the intake memo format, and we have created a memorandum. Let's go for a second to our assignment in the module. So I'm going to go to Module, go to the Modules, go to Module 2, and here is the assignment. This gives you the information. If you are actually going to draft this document once you set up the formatting, what I would do is I would copy it, and I would just plop it down into my document here. You have to change the font. I'm going to save it. I also clean it up because this is now for me. I'm pretending I'm Larry and I'm sending it to Daniel, Deborah, and Jane. But it's not you have sent, it's I. I'm Larry. I have sent this. So you're going to have to clean this up. I have sent, I don't need to say just, I have sent a letter to the county clerk in Collin County to record the claim of lien of Miriam Rivera. I'm just going to say our client. Because all these people also work in our law firm. I want to let you know, or I might just want to say, I may not even have to say, I just may want to let know, I've already said that the letter has been mailed. I might want to say, with the letter, I enclosed. And then you keep on editing. So basically, there's very little drafting that you're going to do. You're just going to make this clean. I'm not going to finish doing the task, but it gives you a flavor for how it is. When you are done, you'll want to read this several times to make sure you haven't inadvertently left a word in, you don't have a weird grammar tense. Things like spelling, punctuation, and style do matter, so spend some time working with this. And you may want to have someone in your family or a friend read it to make sure you haven't left in some typo that you're not able to see. So this is going to conclude our presentation on Interoffice Memoranda. I hope this has been helpful. I look forward to doing future lectures with you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.